Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The mountains of Appalachia have always held their secrets close. Stretching from Alabama to Pennsylvania, these ancient peaks date back over 480 million years, older than the first trees on Earth. Within these mist-shrouded valleys and remote hollows, countless stories remain untold, buried beneath layers of time and collective silence. This particular account centers around one of the most baffling series of disappearances ever documented in the region, a case that has haunted local memory for generations. In the autumn of 1956, the small mining community of Harlan Hollow, nestled deep in the eastern Kentucky mountains, was still riding the post-war coal boom. The hollow itself was barely visible from any main road, a narrow, winding path that followed a creek upstream with steep mountainsides pressing in from both directions. The town had grown organically around the Black Ridge Mining Company operations, which had established a presence there in the late 1890s. Like many such communities in the region, Harlan Hollow existed in near isolation, connected to the wider world primarily through the railroad tracks that carried coal out and brought supplies in. Most residents worked for the mine in some capacity, men underground in the tunnels, women in supporting roles or managing households. The company owned everything: the small company store, where miners purchased goods on credit against future wages, the rows of identical clapboard houses that lined the single, unpaved street, and even the modest church where the community gathered on Sundays. This was the context in which the first man disappeared. Jasper Whitaker, 43 years old and a veteran of 15 years in the mines, failed to return home after his shift on September 17, 1956. His absence was noticed immediately. In a place as small as Harlan Hollow, any deviation from routine raised immediate concern. His wife Meredith reported that he had mentioned nothing unusual that morning, had packed his lunch pail as always, and kissed her goodbye. The mine foreman confirmed that Whitaker had completed his shift and been seen leaving the mine entrance at approximately 5:30 p.m. The first search was informal, fellow miners and neighbors walking the path between the mine and the Whitaker home, calling his name into the thickening evening air. By the following morning, when no trace had been found, the company sent word to the county sheriff in the nearest proper town, some 30 miles away. Sheriff Wade Caldwell arrived that afternoon with 2 deputies. Their initial assessment was that Whitaker had likely fallen into the creek in the darkness, or perhaps wandered off the path due to exhaustion after his shift. A more thorough search followed, with men forming lines to comb the woods surrounding the hollow, checking the creek banks, and exploring the numerous small caves that dotted the hillsides. Meredith Whitaker insisted that her husband knew the area too well to become lost. He was born in these hills, she reportedly told the sheriff. He could find his way home blindfolded. When asked if Whitaker might have left voluntarily, perhaps to seek work elsewhere or to escape some unknown trouble, she was adamant. His supper was waiting. His Sunday shoes were still in the closet. No man leaves without his good shoes. After 3 days, the search was called off. No sign of Jasper Whitaker, no footprints leading away from the path, no torn clothing caught on branches, no blood or signs of a struggle, nothing. The company recorded it as employee departure without notice and hired a replacement within the week. The community, however, was unsettled. Miners began walking home in pairs, children were kept closer to home, but life, as it must, continued. 23 days later, on October 10, 1956, a second miner vanished. Victor Holcomb, 38 years old, disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. He completed his shift, was seen leaving the mine, and simply never arrived home. The search this time was immediate and more extensive. The creek was dragged. Every cave within a 3-mile radius was explored. Sheriff Caldwell brought in tracking dogs from a neighboring county, but they lost any scent at the edge of the company road, near where it branched toward a disused section of the mine. The company records, accessed decades later by researchers, showed an unusual note in the margin next to Holcomb's name. Second incident. Possible connection to Western tunnels? This cryptic notation would later become significant, but at the time it was merely another piece of the growing puzzle. By December 1956, 4 men had disappeared without trace. Whitaker, Holcomb, then Clayton Morris on November 8th, and finally Silas Adkins on December 3rd. All were miners. All had completed their shifts. All had been seen leaving the mine entrance. None had reached their homes, despite the short distance. In no case more than half a mile of well-traveled path. The pattern was impossible to ignore, and fear settled over Harlan Hollow like the winter fog that hung in the valley. Women began meeting their husbands at the mine entrance. The company installed crude electric lights along the path, a rare expense for a business notorious for its frugality. Sheriff Caldwell requested assistance from the state police, but their investigation yielded no new leads. The prevailing theory among law enforcement was that the men had fallen victim to some wild animal, perhaps a mountain lion or a particularly aggressive black bear. The miners, however, whispered different theories. Some spoke of an old legend about the darkness that walks, a shadowy entity said to follow miners who had witnessed things they shouldn't have seen in the deepest tunnels. Others suggested more mundane explanations. Perhaps another mining operation was poaching experienced workers, spiriting them away with promises of better wages. A few even suggested that the disappearances were deliberate actions by the company itself, a way to eliminate workers who had discovered something concerning about the mine's operations or safety. As 1957 began, the disappearances stopped as abruptly as they had started. January and February passed without incident. By March, a cautious normality had returned to Harlan Hollow. The company invested in a night watchman to patrol the path between the mine and the town, though many noted this was more likely to protect the company's interests than the miners themselves. It was during this period of uneasy calm that a document surfaced which would later become central to understanding what happened at Harlan Hollow. A letter dated January 27, 1957, from mine foreman Curtis Hanratty to the company headquarters in Pittsburgh. The letter, preserved in county records, read in part, "Following your directive to expand operations into the western section, my team reports unusual conditions in tunnels W7 through W12. The rock formations do not match our surveys, and there appears to be evidence of prior excavation of unknown origin. Several men have reported unusual acoustic properties in these tunnels, specifically sounds that seem to travel in directions counter to natural echoes. Most concerning, the air quality testing equipment malfunctions consistently in the section. I formally request permission to seal these tunnels pending a more thorough geological assessment." Permission was apparently granted, as company records indicate that the western section was indeed sealed in February 1957. What connection this may have had to the cessation of disappearances was not noted at the time, but later investigators would find the timing significant. The spring and summer of 1957 passed without incident. The disappearances, while not forgotten, began to fade somewhat from immediate concern as other, more pressing matters of daily survival took precedence. The mining operation continued to expand in other directions. New families moved into the houses vacated by the missing men. Life in Harlan Hollow adapted, as life in such communities always did, to the harsh realities of existence in the isolated mountains. In late August 1957, the mine experienced a partial collapse in its eastern section. No miners were injured, but operations were temporarily halted while repairs were made. It was during this work that something unexpected was discovered. A repair team, shoring up a damaged support wall, broke through into what appeared to be an older tunnel, one not on any of the company's maps. According to the report filed by the team supervisor, this tunnel appeared to have been dug using different techniques than those employed by the company, with smoothly curved walls, rather than the squarer cuts typical of modern mining operations. More curious still, the tunnel seemed to connect to the sealed western section, effectively creating a bypass around the barriers erected in February. The repair team sealed this unexpected passage and completed their assigned tasks, dutifully reporting the anomaly to management. The discovery was noted in the company records, but generated no immediate action. Operations resumed on September 5, 1957. 3 days later, the disappearances began again. Between September 8 and December 21, 1957, another 14 men vanished without trace. The pattern was identical to the previous year. All were miners, all were last seen leaving their shifts. None showed any signs of planning to depart, and no traces were ever found despite increasingly desperate searches. The community was gripped by terror. Families began to leave, abandoning homes and possessions rather than risk losing husbands and fathers to whatever fate had claimed the others. By Christmas 1957, Harlan Hollow's population had decreased by almost 30%. The company, facing both labor shortages and growing scrutiny from authorities, announced a temporary suspension of operations pending resolution of security concerns. This suspension would ultimately become permanent, though not for the reasons anyone might have expected. On January 3, 1958, Sheriff Caldwell received an anonymous letter postmarked from a town some 60 miles away. The letter, written in a shaky hand on lined paper torn from a notebook, contained information that would alter the course of the investigation. The writer claimed to be a former employee of Black Ridge Mining who had fled Harlan Hollow out of fear. The letter stated, "What they found in the western tunnels wasn't coal. I was part of the team that first broke through in August '56. There was a chamber there like nothing I'd ever seen, perfectly round and smooth, like it was carved by something spinning. And there were markings on the walls, not writing exactly, more like patterns that hurt your eyes to look at too long. The foreman ordered us to continue excavation, but sworn to secrecy. That's when men started disappearing. They don't just vanish on the path, they're taken from inside the mine itself. I've heard them. We all have. Sounds that come from deeper in, like something dragging heavy weights across stone. I left before they could take me too. Look in the sealed tunnels if you want the truth." Sheriff Caldwell, skeptical but desperate for any lead, organized a small team to investigate the sealed western section of the mine. The company initially resisted but relented when threatened with a broader investigation by state authorities. On January 7, 1958, Caldwell, 2 deputies, and a company engineer entered the mine with the intention of accessing the sealed tunnels. What they found, or what they reported finding, varies depending on which account you believe. The official report filed by Caldwell on January 8th stated simply that they found the tunnels safely sealed and no evidence of any unusual chambers or markings as described in the anonymous letter. The investigation was formally closed, attributed to labor unrest and possible industrial sabotage by competing mining interests. However, a very different account emerged in 1962 when one of the deputies present that day, Elijah Denton, provided a sworn statement to a journalist investigating disappearances in Appalachian mining communities. According to Denton, the team did indeed access the sealed tunnels and found exactly what the anonymous letter had described, an unnatural chamber with walls too smooth to have been created by conventional mining techniques and with strange geometric patterns carved or impressed into the stone. More disturbing still, Denton claimed they found evidence of the missing men, not bodies, but personal effects scattered throughout the chamber and adjoining tunnels. A pocket watch belonging to Jasper Whitaker, Victor Holcomb's wedding ring, a tobacco pouch with Silas Adkins's initials burned into the leather. Most unsettling of all, according to Denton, was a discovery made in what he described as a side chamber, smaller than the main room, and seemingly designed for some purpose none of us could determine. In this chamber, Denton claimed they found what appeared to be a meticulously maintained record written in English, but in a hand none of them recognized. The document listed names, all 28 men who had disappeared, along with numbers, measurements, and notations that made little sense to the search party. Next to each name was a single word: unsuitable. According to Denton, Sheriff Caldwell ordered them to leave everything as they found it and exit the mine immediately. Once outside, he instructed them never to speak of what they had seen. The company engineer was escorted directly to meet with mine management. The western tunnels were not just sealed but completely collapsed in a controlled detonation the following day, officially described as a safety precaution against further structural instability. Denton claimed that he was paid a significant sum of money to maintain silence and subsequently transferred to a sheriff's department in another county. He only came forward with his account after learning that both Sheriff Caldwell and the company engineer had died, Caldwell of an apparent heart attack in 1959, and the engineer in a car accident later that same year. The Black Ridge Mining Company ceased all operations at Harlan Hollow by the end of January 1958. The official reason given was depletion of commercially viable coal seams, but this explanation contradicted their own geological surveys from just months earlier, which had indicated at least 15 more years of productive mining potential. By summer, the company had removed all valuable equipment and effectively abandoned the site. Most remaining residents left soon after, leaving Harlan Hollow to slowly return to wilderness. The case of the 28 missing miners might have faded into obscurity, becoming just another dark footnote in Appalachia's complicated relationship with the coal industry, were it not for what happened in 1967, nearly a decade after the mine closed. A geological survey team from the University of Kentucky, conducting research on groundwater patterns in former mining areas, selected Harlan Hollow as one of their study sites. On April 12, 1967, two researchers ventured into the accessible portions of the abandoned mine to collect water samples. Only one researcher emerged in a state of near catatonia, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to his colleague. When a search team was organized the following day, they found no trace of the missing researcher. What they did find, scratched into the dust near the entrance to what had once been the western tunnels, was a list of 29 names. The first 28 were the names of the miners who had disappeared in 1956 and 1957. The 29th name was that of the missing researcher. The surviving researcher, Dr. Malcolm Thornfield, remained under psychiatric care at the Eastern State Hospital in Lexington for nearly 3 years following the incident. Hospital records indicate that he was initially unable to speak at all, communicating only through drawings, geometric patterns that resembled those allegedly found in the western chambers, though with subtle variations that changed over time. When he finally began to speak again in late 1969, his account of what happened in the mine was deemed too delusional to be credible. According to nursing notes from his treatment, Thornfield claimed that he and his colleague, Dr. James Hendricks, had been collecting water samples near the collapsed entrance to the western tunnels when they noticed a faint vibration in the ground. Thornfield described it as a rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heartbeat coming from deep within the mountain. As they approached the sealed section to investigate, the vibration intensified. Thornfield reported that the collapsed tunnel entrance suddenly appeared less thoroughly sealed than their initial survey had indicated. Where there had been solid rock and debris, they now perceived what seemed to be a narrow passageway just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Dr. Hendricks, the more senior researcher, decided to explore further, instructing Thornfield to wait near the entrance and maintain verbal contact. According to Thornfield, Hendricks entered the passage and proceeded approximately 20 yards before the communication between them became strangely distorted. Hendricks's voice seemed to shift in pitch and tempo, becoming alternately higher and lower, faster and slower, though his words remained comprehensible. He described seeing a chamber ahead with unusual properties. The walls appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, and there were markings that seemed to move when not observed directly. Thornfield claimed that after approximately 15 minutes of exploration, Hendrix's communication abruptly changed. His colleague began speaking in what Thornfield described as a language that used English words but arranged them in patterns that made no semantic sense, yet somehow conveyed meaning beyond the words themselves. The final coherent statement Thornfield reported hearing from Hendrix was, "They're still here. They've always been here. They're measuring us." After that, according to Thornfield, Hendrix's voice faded, replaced by a sound like stone grinding against stone, but with a purpose, like machinery made of rock. Frightened, Thornfield called for his colleague to return. When no response came, he claimed to have entered the passageway himself, proceeding cautiously toward where he had last heard Hendrix's voice. What he found, or believed he found, was not his colleague, but a smooth-walled chamber significantly larger than should have been possible, given the geology of the area. In this chamber, Thornfield claimed to have seen the walls covered with patterns that adjusted themselves as he watched, rearranging into configurations that seemed to respond to his presence. More disturbing, he reported seeing objects scattered on the chamber floor that he recognized as belonging to various individuals, items like watches, rings, and personal effects, arranged in a precise geometric pattern. At the center of this pattern, according to Thornfield, was a document written in what appeared to be English, but in an unfamiliar hand. The document contained a list of names, including all the miners who had disappeared from Harlan Hollow, along with measurements and notations. Next to each name was the word unsuitable. At the bottom of the list was a blank line, as if waiting for another name to be added. Thornfield claimed that, as he examined this document, he became aware of a presence in the chamber with him, not a visible entity, but what he described as a concentration of attention, a focused observation directed at him from all sides simultaneously. He reported feeling as though he were being studied, measured against some incomprehensible standard. The patterns on the walls began to shift more rapidly, and he experienced what he described as a sensation of being weighed in the balance and found adequate. It was at this point, according to his account, that Thornfield fled the chamber, running back through the passageway toward the main tunnel. He reported that as he ran, he could hear movement behind him. Not footsteps, but a sliding, dragging progression that seemed to be gaining on him. Just as he reached the main tunnel, he claimed to have heard Hendrix's voice once more, now speaking in unison with other voices, saying only, "suitable." Thornfield's account, deemed a stress-induced hallucination by his treating physicians, was never included in any official investigation of the incident. The search for Dr. Hendrix was abandoned after 5 days with no results, and the University of Kentucky eventually listed him as presumed deceased due to mining hazard. The mine entrance was more thoroughly sealed following this incident, with concrete and reinforced steel barriers erected under state supervision. The search was officially closed down in September 1967. However, several members of the search team later reported unusual experiences during their time in the mine, though none as extreme as Thornfield's account. Multiple searchers described experiencing disorientation and time perception distortions while near the western tunnel area. 2 reported hearing what sounded like voices coming from behind the collapsed section, though the sounds were indistinct and could not be recorded on the equipment available at the time. Perhaps most unsettling was the testimony of Robert Carrington, the lead engineer overseeing the reinforced sealing of the mine entrance in June 1997. In a letter to his supervisor, later preserved in university archives, Carrington expressed concern about unusual phenomena observed during the sealing process. "I must report certain anomalies that occurred during the final phase of the containment project at Harlan Hollow. On 3 separate occasions, sensing equipment registered movement behind the collapsed section we were sealing, despite geological surveys confirming no open spaces should exist in that area. More concerning were the temperature fluctuations recorded near the western tunnel access point, dropping as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit when our team approached that specific area. then returning to normal when we moved away. Most troubling was an incident on the final day of operations. As the last concrete pour was being completed, all members of the team reported hearing a sound best described as a low-frequency vibration coming from deep within the sealed section. This vibration was powerful enough to be felt through the soles of our boots and caused small pebbles on the tunnel floor to arrange themselves in distinct geometric patterns before our eyes. These patterns bore a striking resemblance to the drawings produced by Dr. Thornfield during his hospitalization, though none of our team had ever seen those drawings. I recommend no further investigation of this site and suggest classification of all records pertaining to the Harlan Hollow incident. There are matters in this world that fall outside conventional scientific understanding, and I believe we have encountered one such matter here. Carrington's recommendation was apparently heeded. All records relating to both the original disappearances and the subsequent incidents involving the university research team were collected and sealed under an administrative classification rarely used for mining incidents. Access to these records required special permission from both the State Geological Survey Office and the University Board of Regents, a dual authority requirement that effectively ensured the information remained inaccessible to casual researchers. The case of the 28 missing miners and the subsequent disappearance of Dr. Hendricks might have remained buried in administrative obscurity were it not for the efforts of one determined individual, Margaret Whittaker, daughter of Jasper Whittaker, the first miner to disappear. Born 6 months after her father's disappearance, Margaret grew up with the mystery as a defining element of her identity. In 1987, as a graduate student in Appalachian studies at Morehead State University, she began a systematic investigation into what happened at Harlan Hollow, determined to uncover the truth about her father's fate. Margaret's research was meticulous and wide-ranging. She collected oral histories from surviving residents of Harlan Hollow and neighboring communities. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests to access sealed records. She tracked down former employees of the Black Ridge Mining Company, including several who had been present during the initial discovery of the Western Chambers but had never been interviewed by authorities. One such individual was Samuel Hawkins, who had worked as an assistant surveyor for Black Ridge in 1956. In an interview conducted by Margaret in 1988, Hawkins provided a perspective that had not been included in any official record. I was part of the team that first mapped the western section after the initial breakthrough in August '56. What we found there wasn't natural. The main chamber was perfectly round, about 40 feet in diameter, with walls so smooth they felt polished. The strange thing was, our measuring equipment gave different readings depending on who was using it and when, as if the dimensions of the space itself were somehow flexible. The patterns on the walls weren't carved or painted on. They seemed to be part of the stone itself, like they'd grown there, and they weren't static. You'd look at one section, then look away, and when you looked back, the pattern would have subtly changed. Not dramatically, just enough to make you question your memory. The foreman ordered us to continue mapping, but told us not to discuss what we'd seen with anyone outside the survey team. About a week later, they brought in some men from the company headquarters, scientists, or engineers, I guess. They spent 2 days in the chamber with equipment I didn't recognize. After that, regular mining operations were extended into the western tunnels, but certain sections, including the main chamber, were designated as restricted areas. That's when things started happening. Tools would go missing only to reappear in different places. Men reported hearing voices in tunnels that should have been empty. And then Whittaker disappeared. I quit 2 weeks after that. I knew something wasn't right, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed, and whatever was in those western tunnels was one of those things. Margaret Whittaker's investigation also uncovered medical records for miners who had worked specifically in the western tunnels between August and December 1956. The most common complaints were severe headaches, described as a pressure behind the eyes that intensifies when thinking about the worksite, and sleep disturbances characterized by geometric patterns appearing in dreams and sensations of being observed while sleeping. Several miners reported experiencing momentary disorientation while in the western tunnels, including brief periods where familiar surroundings seem foreign or altered in subtle ways. Most concerning were psychological evaluations conducted on 5 miners who had reported more severe symptoms. These records, obtained through a protracted legal battle with the company's successor corporation, revealed a pattern of unusual symptoms among these workers, symptoms not reported by miners working in other sections of the mine. These evaluations, performed by a company-employed physician, noted obsessive focus on patterns and measurements and compulsive recording of bodily dimensions. 2 miners were diagnosed with work-related stress disorders and reassigned to different areas of the mine. One of these miners, Nathaniel Reed, subsequently disappeared on November 26, 1956, becoming the 3rd man to vanish from Harlan Hollow. The company physician's notes on Reed's case included a troubling final entry, dated 2 days before his disappearance. Patient continues to report that they are measuring him and finding him increasingly suitable. When asked to identify who they are, he becomes agitated and claims they have always been in the mountain, waiting. Patient exhibits signs of paranoid delusion but maintains normal function in work activities. Recommend continued monitoring, but no immediate intervention required. Margaret Whitaker's research culminated in a doctoral dissertation titled The Disappeared Industrial Exploitation and Community Trauma in Appalachian Mining Towns, completed in 1991. While academic in tone and methodology, the dissertation contained a wealth of previously undocumented information about the Harlan Hollow incident, presenting it as a case study in how corporate power could effectively suppress information and shape official narratives, even in cases of multiple disappearances. The dissertation received little attention outside academic circles at the time of its publication. However, in 1995, portions of Whitaker's research were featured in a regional documentary about Appalachian mining communities, bringing renewed interest to the Harlan Hollow case. This attention proved short-lived. The production company responsible for the documentary experienced a catastrophic fire that destroyed most of their archive just weeks after the initial broadcast, and no complete copies of the program were known to survive. Margaret Whitaker herself became increasingly reclusive following the completion of her dissertation. Colleagues reported that she continued her research privately, but became reluctant to discuss her findings. Her last known public statement on the matter came in a 1997 letter to the editor of an Appalachian cultural journal, in which she wrote, "After a decade of investigation into what happened at Harlan Hollow, I have concluded that some truths resist conventional documentation. The disappearance of 28 men, including my father, from a single community over the course of 16 months represents a tragedy that demands explanation. Yet the more I uncover, the more I question whether human systems of knowledge are adequate to comprehend what occurred there. The patterns persist. They emerge in the geological surveys, in the timing of the disappearances, in the selection of specific individuals from among the mining population. There is a mathematical precision to these events that suggests design, rather than accident or conventional human malevolence. I no longer seek merely to document what happened, but to understand why these specific men were taken and by what." No further publications or public statements from Margaret Whitaker appeared after this letter. In 2002, her home in Lexington, Kentucky was found abandoned, with personal belongings and research materials still in place, but no sign of Whitaker herself. A missing persons report was filed, but the investigation produced no meaningful leads. Her case remains open but inactive in Kentucky state records. The Harlan Hollow site itself has remained effectively sealed and isolated in the decades since the mine's closure. In 1972, the land was purchased by a conservation trust with connections to the Blackridge corporate structure, ostensibly to preserve the natural environment and prevent hazardous exploration of abandoned mining infrastructure. The trust established a no trespassing zone encompassing the former town site and mine entrance, patrolled regularly by private security personnel. In 1986, a team from the U.S. Geological Survey attempted to conduct a standard magnetic anomaly survey of the area as part of a regional mapping project. Their equipment reportedly malfunctioned consistently when directed toward the sealed western section of the mine. The official report attributed this to probable high metal content in the surrounding rock formation, but internal communications, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, suggested a more unusual explanation. In a memo dated October 3, 1986, the lead geophysicist wrote to his supervisor, "The anomalous readings near the Harlan Hollow site do not correspond to any known geological formation or mineral composition. The pattern of interference suggests organized electromagnetic activity of artificial origin, yet the depth and isolation of the site preclude conventional human technology as a source. I recommend a more thorough investigation with specialized equipment, possibly with military consultation." No record exists of any such follow-up investigation having been conducted. In 1998, advances in ground-penetrating radar technology allowed for a remote survey of the Harlan Hollow site without requiring physical access to the restricted area. This survey, conducted by a research team from Virginia Tech, revealed something unexpected. The sealed western tunnels appeared to extend much further and deeper than any known mining maps had indicated, reaching depths of nearly 3,000 feet, in a region where coal seams typically existed at 400–800 feet below surface level. More puzzling still, the survey detected what appeared to be a large spherical chamber at the terminus of these deep tunnels, a chamber approximately 200 feet in diameter, with a perfectly regular shape impossible to attribute to natural geological processes or conventional mining techniques. When these findings were submitted for peer review, the research team was asked to recheck their calculations and equipment calibration. A second survey, conducted 6 months later, found no evidence of either the deep tunnels or the spherical chamber. The lead researcher, Dr. Eleanor Samuels, subsequently published a paper in the Journal of Applied Geophysics titled "Temporal Anomalies in Subsurface Imaging: Equipment Limitations or Evidence of Dynamic Geological Structures." The paper was heavily criticized by colleagues and ultimately retracted at the request of the university administration. Dr. Samuels took an unexpected early retirement shortly thereafter and reportedly relocated to New Zealand, where she has declined all requests for interviews regarding her work at Harlan Hollow. In 2003, the Conservation Trust that owned the Harlan Hollow site transferred ownership to a newly formed private research foundation with apparent connections to both government agencies and corporate interests. The foundation immediately implemented enhanced security measures, including motion sensors, aerial surveillance, and a permanent security team. Public access to the surrounding area was further restricted under the guise of environmental protection. Local residents reported increased activity at the site beginning in early 2004, heavy equipment being transported to the area under cover of darkness, specialized drilling apparatus, and temporary structures erected near the former mine entrance. Official inquiries about this activity were met with firm responses, citing environmental remediation and containment of potential hazardous materials as the purpose of the work. In 2007, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by an environmental watchdog organization revealed that the Research Foundation had obtained permits for deep geological exploration and containment infrastructure at the Harlan Hollow site. The specific nature of this work was classified under a national security provision rarely applied to geological research, raising questions about what exactly was being explored or contained at the site. Satellite imagery from this period shows the construction of what appears to be a reinforced concrete structure over the former mine entrance, along with a network of support buildings and power generation equipment. By 2010, this facility was complete, and most visible activity at the site had ceased. The Foundation continues to maintain ownership and security of the area, though its purpose and activities remain largely unknown to the public. Throughout these decades of official investigation, corporate obfuscation, and academic inquiry, the residents of communities surrounding Harlan Hollow have maintained their own understanding of what occurred there. Oral histories collected from these communities reveal a consistent narrative quite different from the official explanations of mining accidents, labor disputes, or environmental hazards. Vera Lockwood, who lived in a neighboring hollow during the disappearances and was interviewed in 2012 at the age of 94, expressed the local perspective succinctly. Those men weren't taken by any person or any animal that walks on this earth. What took them has been in those mountains since before people came to these hills. The old-timers knew about it. They had stories about the watchers in the deep places and those who measure men's worth. They knew to leave certain caves and hollows undisturbed. But the mining companies didn't listen to such tales. They dug where they shouldn't have dug, and they found what wasn't meant to be found. This sentiment that the Harlan Hollow incident represented a consequence of violating ancient boundaries echoes throughout the oral histories of the region. Many accounts reference similar elements, entities that dwell deep within the mountains, patterns that affect human perception, and a process of selection or measurement applied to those who venture too deeply into certain places. Whether these narratives represent cultural responses to unexplained trauma, the persistence of pre-industrial belief systems, or genuine insights into what occurred at Harlan Hollow remains an open question. What is clear is that the disappearance of 28 men, and later a university researcher, from a single location over a relatively short period represents a mystery that has never been adequately explained by conventional investigation. In 2015, a digital archive of Black Ridge Mining Company records was anonymously donated to the Appalachian Studies program at East Tennessee State University. Among these records was a document that had not appeared in any previous collection, a report dated August 15, 1956, apparently written by a company geologist immediately after the initial breakthrough into the western chambers. Most of the document consists of technical measurements and observations, but the conclusion contains a passage that seems to foreshadow the events that would follow. The chamber discovered in the western extension exhibits properties that defy conventional geological explanation. Its dimensions appear to vary slightly between measurements, though always maintaining perfect spherical symmetry. The patterns observed on the interior surface are unlike any known mineral formation or fossil imprint, displaying characteristics more consistent with a form of written language or mathematical notation. Most concerning is the apparent reaction of these patterns to human presence. Multiple team members have reported observing subtle changes in the configurations when the patterns are not under direct observation. Equipment left in the chamber overnight recorded temperature and barometric fluctuations that correlate precisely with the periods when the chamber was unoccupied, suggesting some form of activity occurs in the absence of observers. I cannot escape the impression that we have not simply discovered a natural formation, but have rather exposed something that was deliberately concealed. The precision of the chamber's construction and the organized complexity of the patterns indicate purpose and intelligence behind their creation. Yet the age of the surrounding rock formations would place this creation far beyond the timeline of human civilization in this region, or indeed human civilization anywhere on Earth. I strongly advise against further excavation until we can better understand the nature and origin of this discovery. Some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. This recommendation was evidently ignored. 2 days after this report was filed, the company authorized expanded operations in the western tunnels. 1 month later, the first miner disappeared. In 2018, a former security contractor who had worked at the Research Foundation's Harlan Hollow facility between 2004 and 2011 provided an anonymous interview to a journalist investigating unusual research sites throughout Appalachia. According to this source, the work conducted at the site had little to do with environmental remediation or conventional geological research. What they built there wasn't about keeping people out. It was about keeping something in. The facility extends at least 15 levels below ground, with the deepest sections requiring special clearance even for security personnel. I never went below level 7 myself, but I transported researchers and equipment to the deeper access points. The researchers weren't geologists or environmental scientists. Most had backgrounds in theoretical physics, nonlinear mathematics, or linguistics. They spoke about their work in coded terms, but I gathered they were studying some kind of communication system, or language, embedded in geometric patterns. They would bring up core samples that had these patterns running through them like text in a book. The strangest thing was the effect the facility had on electronic equipment. Anything with a processor or memory storage would begin to malfunction after about 3 weeks on site, displaying patterns on screens, rearranging stored data into geometric configurations. The researchers seemed to expect this and treated it as data rather than a problem to be fixed. In my last year there, they brought in some kind of containment chamber, a perfect sphere about 20 feet in diameter, made of a material I couldn't identify. It wasn't metal or concrete or any conventional construction material. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This chamber was installed at the deepest level, and after that, all non-essential personnel were removed from the facility. I left shortly after that. Some things you don't want to know more about. Whether this account represents genuine insider information or an elaborate contribution to the growing mythology surrounding Harlan Hollow cannot be definitively determined. What is certain is that the site remains restricted, the Research Foundation continues to maintain its presence there, and the fate of 29 individuals who disappeared into the darkness of those mountains remains officially unresolved. In 2023, advanced satellite imaging detected what analysts described as regular geometric anomalies in the subsurface terrain extending outward from the Harlan Hollow site in a precise radial pattern. These anomalies, which appear to be tunnel-like structures at depths of 1,000 to 3,000 feet, radiate from the central location of the former mine for distances of up to 20 miles in all directions. No known mining operation in the region, historical or contemporary, corresponds to these structures, and their regular, symmetrical pattern defies explanation by natural geological processes. When questioned about these findings, representatives of the Research Foundation stated only that they were aware of the complex subsurface geology in the region, and that their work included monitoring natural formations for potential environmental impact. No further explanation was provided, and subsequent requests for information have been declined. Today, the story of the 28 miners and one researcher who vanished from Harlan Hollow exists in multiple forms, as an unsolved mystery in official records, as an example of corporate negligence and cover-up in academic studies, and as a warning tale in the oral traditions of Appalachian communities. These varying narratives reflect not just different interpretations of events, but different approaches to understanding the boundaries between the known and the unknown. For those who prefer rational explanations, the disappearances represent either a series of conventional crimes concealed by corporate influence or the tragic consequences of unsafe mining practices. The more unusual elements of the case, the sealed chambers, the strange patterns, the precise selection of individuals, become embellishments added by folklore or deliberate disinformation intended to obscure more mundane truths. For others, particularly those with deep connections to the Appalachian landscape and its traditions, Harlan Hollow represents something else entirely, a glimpse into realities that exist alongside our own, occasionally intersecting in ways that defy conventional understanding. In this perspective, the ancient mountains hold entities and intelligences far older than humanity. operating according to priorities and perceptions fundamentally different from our own. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these extremes, in the shadowed territory where human activity intersects with forces not fully understood or acknowledged. The mines of Appalachia have always been places of darkness and danger, where men venture deep into the earth to extract its resources and sometimes fail to return to the light. In most cases, these tragedies have mundane, if heartbreaking explanations: collapses, explosions, flooding, poisonous gases. But in the case of Harlan Hollow, where 28 men and later a researcher vanished without trace, without evidence, without explanation, where investigations were abandoned, records sealed, and the site itself placed under persistent guard, one must at least consider the possibility that something occurred there that falls outside conventional categories of understanding. Whatever the truth, the fact remains that 29 individuals entered the darkness beneath those ancient mountains and never emerged. Their names remain on missing persons lists, their fates officially undetermined. For their families and descendants, the mystery offers no closure, only persistent questions that echo like footsteps in abandoned tunnels, growing neither louder nor fainter with the passage of time. In the small communities that still dot the surrounding hollows, residents continue to avoid the area around the former mining town. They tell their children to stay away from the fenced perimeter with its warning signs and surveillance cameras. They speak in hushed tones about the watchers in the deep, about patterns that change when not observed directly, about processes of measurement and selection conducted according to standards no human can comprehend. And sometimes, on particularly still nights when the modern world seems distant and the ancient darkness of the mountains presses close, they claim to hear sounds carrying through the ground itself, rhythmic vibrations like massive machinery operating far below the surface, or perhaps like stone grinding against stone with slow, deliberate purpose. Counting, perhaps, measuring, waiting with the patience of geological time for the next name to be added to a list begun long ago. For in the ancient hollows of Appalachia, where coal and darkness have been extracted in equal measure for generations, some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. And what waits behind those doors, patient, meticulous, operating according to priorities formed long before humanity walked these mountains, continues its work, measuring those who venture too deeply against criteria we cannot comprehend, finding most unsuitable but perhaps occasionally identifying someone who meets its inscrutable standards. The 28 men of Harlan Hollow discovered this truth. So did Dr. James Hendricks in 1967. The question that echoes through the sealed tunnels of a forgotten mine in a vanished town is whether they represent the conclusion of something, or merely the beginning.